Thank you everyone for joining us today in the second webinar in our 5-part How to Get Published series with our publisher partner, Taylor&Francis. This initiative is co-hosted by the North America and Latin America and the Caribbean hubs of EURAXESS worldwide, which I will explain in more detail shortly. I'd like to open with a few quick comments on the format. My colleague Daria and I make up the EURAXESS North America hub, and we are based in the United States. She is running the show behind the scenes. And if you're a researcher based in the US or Canada, we are your point people to learn more about Europe as a research destination and to support your career development. Our colleagues from the EURAXESS LAC hub are based in Mexico and Brazil and cover all of Latin America and the Caribbean. Vicky and Charlotte will host the next webinar, which takes place on Thursday, May 27th, and will address how to promote your work after publication. As a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards. We will occasionally share links and messages using the chat feature. So if you don't see incoming chat messages, please just refresh this page in your browser. You can also submit your questions via the Q&A feature, which I will moderate after the main presentation. I know our main speaker has a lot of great content, so you may wish to hold some of your questions till the later part, since I'm sure she'll address a lot of common questions. I'll give a brief introduction to EURAXESS, and then after that, you'll hear from Genevieve Nesom, the Ethics and Integrity Manager at Taylor&Francis Group. So with that, I'd like to explain our work. EURAXESS is a European Commission initiative that promotes researcher mobility and career development. We share European funding opportunities. We provide support to researchers in a variety of forms, including information dissemination, trainings, webinars like these, and much more. The EURAXESS hubs outside of Europe allow us to serve as your point of contact to get connected with and stay connected to Europe, as well as to look for host institutions or partners in Europe. We aim to help you better understand the European Commission funding opportunities and then learn in depth about the many grants, fellowships, job postings, and more funded by the EU. The EURAXESS national portals throughout Europe provide country-level expertise. So if you know the nation you're interested in moving to, EURAXESS service centers throughout that country will help you learn about the logistical matters and any questions you have so that you can spend more time focusing on your research itself, and rest assured that you have a support system before you even make the move. The screen I have up right now is just a quick screenshot of the website. I think there's a lot of really good information. It can be a bit overwhelming if it's your first time and you don't know what you're looking for, but when you understand all the services that are offered, it becomes quite self-explanatory. So on the EURAXESS portal, the bread and butter service that's offered is the jobs board and funding board, where you can filter on based on the country, based on the funding source, based on the research level, and then any specific keywords. After that, there's a lot of career development tools, both within Europe and then within the EURAXESS hubs. So we hope you'll stay connected to us in North America and Latin America and the Caribbean. There's a partner search tool, just like there's the job board, and then a lot of information and assistance. The national portals, which I mentioned earlier, are where you can go into the specific EURAXESS country presence and ask on-the-ground experts. And then finally, EURAXESS Worldwide is just the branding or the naming for the EURAXESS presence outside of Europe. So as I mentioned earlier, here in the Western Hemisphere, you have representatives from both EURAXESS North America and Latin America and the Caribbean today, and we serve as your primary points of contact. So in closing, regardless of your nationality, your research field, or your career stage, if you are based anywhere in the Americas, our 2 EURAXESS hubs are designated to serve you. We encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions and comments after the webinar so we can get to know you better and then shape our activities and our content around the needs of our members. So with that, I'd like to transition to the main presentation and welcome Genevieve Nesom to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Jackson. Let me get my slides up. I am really happy to be here today. Thanks for the invitation.
So I made you presenter. It should pop up in just a moment.
Okay, just let me know when you can see it. How's it look?
All right, I see you.
Great.
Great.
Okay, well, while my PowerPoint is getting pulled up, I'll introduce myself. My name is Genevieve Nesom. I'm the Publishing Ethics Integrity Manager at Taylor&Francis. I'm part of a team of 5 who are based out of the UK and New Zealand. I'm the US contact. We have at Taylor&Francis 3 different publishing ethics and integrity managers, including myself, a director, and a head. And together we look out for the scholarly integrity of the content we publish. And today,
Oh, I'll just
yeah.
take your full screen. I continue your introduction, please. I'll take my webcam off, and I look forward. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Jackson. Let me go right back. So today I'll go through publishing ethics and integrity and scholarly publishing. We'll go through the basics of publication ethics and who guides this, common issues that arise with publishing ethics, the responsibility of authors, post-publication notices, including corrections, expressions of concerns, and retractions, and tips on avoiding problems, such as those post-publication notices. So first, what is publication ethics? At its basics level, publication ethics is the field of applied ethics or professional ethics. So it's ethics, meaning how to decide what is right and wrong in a specific field of publishing. And it's based on a consensus about best standards and best practices. And the consensus is composed of different players within the publishing world. And that includes different societies, associations, including the Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the World Association of Medical Editors, and then the Committee of Publication Ethics, or COPE, that's in the middle of the screen, does its best to take all of the different feedback and synthesize it into coherent guidance. And with this guidance, that we are working to ensure the integrity of the scholarly record so that readers can trust what they read and ensure that scholars can build upon published work. So this is a visual we like to show. It shows the trend or the growth of retractions, retracted papers over time, starting in 1997 with 62 retractions all the way to 2015 with 946. So that's a pretty big growth, and we do expect it to keep growing. The majority of these retractions are due to fraud, which includes fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and other types of misconduct, including fake peer review. A question you might have is, why is it growing so much? And a lot of it is because of the increased attention that's shown to retracted articles. And this analysis is produced by Science and Retraction Watch, and Retraction Watch has been a big help to publicize the importance of retractions. So issues that can arise within publishing ethics, there are a lot. Just scan your eyes down this list. We'll go over some of the most relevant ones. And in this presentation, we'll go over authorship issues, including ghost, gift, and just general authorship disputes. Competing interests, maybe you know it as conflict of interest. Consent to publish identifiable information, including people in the acknowledgements section. Data or image fabrication or falsification, and other aspects such as p-hacking, where you rerun your analyses until you get a p-value that you like. Duplicate submission and publication, plagiarism of text and ideas, and finally, text recycling, also known as redundant publication. So to start, we'll go through authorship. So who qualifies to be an author of a paper? These are the Taylor&Francis authorship criteria. We have 5, and they're substantially similar to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. These are the questions we ask all authors of Taylor&Francis articles to ask themselves to make sure they do qualify to be an author. They're pretty basic. You need to have made a significant contribution to the work in a variety of different ways. You have drafted or written or substantially revised the article at all stages, and that includes before publication, before submission, during peer review, once the paper's been accepted, and any changes after the proofing. That you agree with your co-authors, if there are any, on the journal to which the article will be submitted. And finally, that you agree to take responsibility for the content of the article indefinitely. Any listed author is a representative of the paper and agrees to share accountability, and this does come with legal responsibilities. So what are types of authorship disputes? at its basic level, authorship disputes cannot be resolved by the publisher. An example of an authorship dispute would be prior to submission or after submission during peer review, the corresponding author wants to remove the fourth author, and the fourth author disagrees. He says, I meet all of the authorship criteria. I need to be listed as a co-author. The corresponding author refutes this. This is something that we can't resolve as the publisher. We don't have any evidence of who contributed to the work. This is something that the author's institutions need to get involved in and adjudicate. Luckily, if a manuscript has not been published and there's a dispute, we put the paper on hold. We stop the peer review. If the paper is about to be published, we put that on hold, put the issue on hold, and ask the institution to investigate. And this can take many months. It's not a fast process. It's just it's your basic interpersonal dispute. Anything you can imagine is possible. Once consensus is reached between authors, including anybody who wants to be removed, then we can proceed. All authors need to agree on the changes, including the persons being added or removed. And the best practice is to ask all authors to confirm they agree to the new author list and order. The corresponding author is responsible for coordinating, but we do want to hear from all authors to make sure there's a consensus. So gift authorship. What is gift authorship? This is where often you want to potentially make the prestige of your authorship list look a little better. And so you could add in a high-ranking faculty member at your university to make it seem as though you collaborated with him. That's one way of how gift authorship could go. But it's a dishonest representation of who is actually involved in the work, and it encourages dishonest scholarly behavior. And sometimes the people who have been gifted, such as this faculty member, don't even know that they're listed as an author. And as we just discussed, being an author comes with legal responsibilities, and that puts them in a precarious legal situation that they did not ask to be in. So the takeaway from this is authors that are listed on the paper need to truly meet the authorship criteria and completely be aware that they're listed as authors and aware of the responsibilities that comes with it. Authorship for sale. This has been a new trend that we're seeing. Agency-led paper mills. You might have seen this in the news recently. Agency-led paper mills are thought to sell authorship to papers that often contain fake data, manipulated or stock images, and high levels of plagiarism. And the theory of how we think this is going is that authorship spots, such as first or last author, or even in between for varying levels of money, are sold. And this leads to publication of dishonest and reliable work, duplicate submissions. If you're submitting, if this company that's selling authorship submits the same paper with different authors to different journals, which would eventually result in a retraction. Salami slicing, that's where you take kind of one main study and publish as many different versions of results as you can, often without attributing the original study. And this can cause reputational damage, but often if you're purchasing an authorship, you know the risk. Ghost authorship. This most commonly, I guess the most common example I can think of is, say you work for a pharmaceutical company and you want to write an article that promotes a certain drug, but you don't want it to be obvious that you have this competing interest with this company, so you ask a physician from a local hospital to put their name as the author. So it looks like this physician is promoting this drug just out of his own interest, when in fact it was written by somebody who does have an interest in the success of this drug. And this is different than having medical or science writers who help you with the technical aspects. Ghost authorship is most often writing the complete paper. It gives a lack of credit for those who have contributed to the work. It conceals involvement of those who have influenced the research, and most importantly, conceals relevant competing interests, which we'll talk about more. And now we're at competing interests. So, woo, another big slide of competing interests. These are from our editorial policies. You can see them on taylorandfrancis.com. Competing interests are anything that might be perceived as influencing the content of your article and something that readers might want to be aware of. So going back to the last example, if the article promoting a certain drug was written by an employee of a pharmaceutical company, readers might be interested in knowing that the author works for this pharmaceutical company and that that might have influenced the content of the article, such as a positive spin or a negative spin if you're writing about perhaps a competing drug. So we'll go through some examples. Examples of financial competing interests. This is the top section. This is what most people think about when they think about competing interest is money. This can include employment or voluntary involvement. And how this is addressed is simply by providing your affiliation at the top of the manuscript. You just say where you work. That's a competing interest, and yet it's not a big deal if you state it. Grants paid to you or your organization. Again, this is addressed very simply in the financial disclosures or the funding statement at the end of your article. You don't have to say how much money, you just say you got some money. Or personal fees, same thing, just say that you've received personal fees. It's really common for people to receive fees that might influence the content of their article. And as long as you say that and let readers think for themselves, it's fine to publish. Examples of non-financial competing interests. This is the second paragraph. Examples include gifts, drugs, programs, anything that might benefit or be at a disadvantage financially or reputationally from the published findings. This could even be personal competing interests, such as your religious, your ideological, or your intellectual competing interests. For example, if you're writing an article about social constructs within an indigenous community, and you are in fact a member of this indigenous community, that would be a relevant competing interest that readers might want to be aware of, because it shows that you have some kind of insider knowledge, or you might be biased in favor of this community. Again, competing interests are not bad. That's why the name has been changed colloquially from conflict of interest to competing interest. And that's partly to encourage people to disclose them. On to consent to publish. So consent to publish is required for any identifiable patient or participant information, including age, gender, diagnosis, treatment, occupation, etc. It's also required for images of patients, videos, audio recordings. So this could be if you're publishing a case study, even if you don't include the name of a participant, if they can be identified based on an image, however remote the possibility, it's increasingly becoming easy to identify people based on factors other than their name. It could be if they have a rare disease and it's a small rare disease community, and they have some kind of identifiable body features as a result of this disease. They might be identifiable, even if they have a black bar over their eyes and you don't give any private health information. So authors should include a statement within the manuscript to confirm that they have obtained consent to publish from the participants. And this is often different than informed consent to participate in a research study. Oftentimes, informed consent to participate in a research study do have a clause about publishing results. And if so, then that covers consent to publish. But if the informed consent does not have anything explicitly about consent to publish, you should obtain this separately. We have retracted articles or fully removed them, or images within articles that are identifiable, because authors simply assumed that the person being named or described would be okay, when in fact they're not okay with it. And it's truly up to the patient or participant to decide whether they want this information about them released. Taylor&Francis has a consent to publish form. available to authors. It's online. You can use this link. We'll send you a copy of the slides afterwards. It just describes that information about you will be published, consent. We sometimes do request a copy of this. It doesn't need to be our form, but you're more than welcome to use this if you need a place to get started. Acknowledgements. Authors need to notify and obtain permission from anyone named within the acknowledgement section. Again, you might think it's a huge compliment to name somebody in the acknowledgement, but people have a right to privacy and how their name is being used. You need to give them their option to not be named. And this can even bring up another conversation that needs to be had, such as the person who's being acknowledged might think they should be an author rather than being acknowledged. In which case, figure out the authorship disagreement prior to publication. Now we're on to the more substantive issues, including duplicate submissions and publication. So duplicate submission, this is simply where you submit the same article to multiple journals. We ask authors when they submit to Taylor&Francis journals to confirm that they have not submitted to more than one journal. But prior to publication, you sign a legally binding publishing agreement. This is also known as the copyright agreement. Prior to publication in a journal, you sign a copyright agreement that either gives you, if it's open access, Taylor&Francis, if it's a traditional subscription model, or sometimes a blend, the rights to the copyright. And if this article is published in another journal by another publisher, then that infringes on the copyright agreement. And that's what we mean by legally binding. So even if you submit an article to a journal and it seems like they're taking forever to review it, months, don't submit it to another journal. Instead, follow up with the journal that's taking a long time, ask what's going on, and if it's going to take too long, ask to withdraw that paper prior to submitting it to another journal. If we find that an article has been published again after it was already published in Taylor&Francis, oftentimes that will the article will be retracted. Is it ever okay for a duplicate submission? There are some cases where it's kind of a gray area, such as publishing in another language. If your article is published in German first, it is typically okay to translate it and publish it in English, as long as the German publisher has given permission to do so. Another example is data presented at conferences in short abstracts. Generally, that is okay text to use again. Or, of course, preprints, which are getting to be very popular. A preprint does not restrict you from publishing the full same article in a journal. There's a difference between a preprint and the version of record. The version of record is the final version that's been peer-reviewed, that has the quote added value from a publisher. But in any situation, transparency is key, and any previous full version, such as a preprint, should be referenced within the final version, and state this up front upon submission so that the editor knows that there's a preprint. Sometimes people have questions about whether this will affect peer review. For example, if the peer reviewers could find you, if it's a double-blind peer review, if they find your preprint with your name on it, does that affect the peer review process? It might, but preprints are here to stay, and that's that's part of the game. Now we're on to plagiarism and text recycling. Plagiarism, this is a pretty common one. A lot of people know about it already. It's the appropriation of another person or group's ideas, processes, results, figures, or words without giving appropriate credit. So text or ideas. There's plagiarism of ideas, which is harder to prove, and plagiarism of text, which is relatively easy. This plagiarism includes contents from books, websites, blogs, anything that's written down. And this it touches on copyright, that as soon as you've created something unique, it is copyrighted by the original author, and consent to republish or appropriate citation or referencing is needed if you want to reuse it. We use Authenticate, which is a plagiarism checker. It's also known as Crossref or Turnitin. Turnitin is the academic version for universities. If we are tipped off to any kind of plagiarism, we will investigate it and we'll ask the authors to first explain before accusing them of plagiarism. And then self-plagiarism, this is the excessive and repeated use of your own work, including figures, text, data, or ideas. It leads to redundant publication, distorts the scholarly record in that you're publishing the same thing multiple times. This does not include everything. So especially in method sections, sometimes there's one sentence that you have to describe a method that you use that's just a really good way, and perhaps like the best way of explaining a statistical method. One sentence would not be a big deal. That's almost expected. That if you're working in the same field doing similar studies, especially if they're highly technical, we would expect you to use some of the same language. But it really depends on the amount and the context. So method section would be understandable, but if you're using the same paragraph for your conclusion in every manuscript, that would be questionable, because it would seem that if you're reaching the same conclusion, you're just doing the same experiment with different ways of describing it. And just like plagiarism, any text recycling will be investigated, and the authors will be first asked for an explanation. And we mentioned the authors will be first asked for an explanation, in that we don't just retract the paper without giving the authors an opportunity to explain themselves. Sometimes it's truly a mistake. Onto data and image integrity. And in this sense, we use data and images interchangeably. So this is an article by Dr. Elizabeth Dick. She's been in the news quite a bit lately as an image sleuth or a super spotter. She's really good at scanning academic papers and identifying images that are being reused or that have been manipulated or photoshopped. She did an analysis of 20,000 papers from 40 journals and found that approximately 1 of every 25 papers contains inappropriately duplicated images. Quite high. So this is our policy, the Taylor&Francis policy on images and data. The key here is that authors should be prepared to share their original, uncropped, unprocessed images with the journal editorial office upon request. So once you create maybe a nice JPEG image that fits within your manuscript, don't delete your original images. We'll often request you to share these if there are any concerns, such as a reader says something looks wrong with this image, can we see the original one? Generally, we expect these to be about 300 DPI in terms of quality. Now, rounding out to ensuring the integrity of the scholarly record. Post-publication notices. When, what, and why. Post-publication notices are attached to the original article. The purpose of these are to correct the scholarly record and ensure its integrity. And there are 3 types. The first is a correction. Corrections are issued if there's no serious breach of publication or research ethics, such as something to correct a minor error that does not affect the conclusion. So if your article, if you find a mistake and it actually changes the conclusions, we would not issue a correction. That's too big of an error. Next level is an expression of concern. Expressions of concerns are issued pretty rarely. And they're specifically issued if an investigation is inconclusive or taking a long time, but we want the public to know that we are concerned about the article and that careful consideration is needed when evaluating the article. Authors will be informed prior to the expression of concern because it's a heavy notice, and it's a permanent notice. It's given its own DOI. And finally, there's retractions. Retractions are issued if there's a serious breach of publication or research ethics, such as if the findings are unreliable, or if there is misconduct involved, such as fraud that we mentioned earlier, like fabrication, falsification, or manipulation. If there's duplicate publication, such as publishing the same article twice, one of those will be retracted. Usually it's the one that was published second. Plagiarism or unethical research, such as if there's an article where participants were recruited for a medical study, but were not actually given an opportunity to provide informed consent, that could be retracted. However, sometimes there's honest errors that cause a problem, such as an error with your data analysis, and authors will instigate the retraction. This is considered good scholarly behavior. It's unfortunate that there's only one retraction, whether it's for good or bad reasons. But that's why the content of the retraction notice is important. It tells a story of what happened. When an article is retracted, the original article remains online, but with a retracted, the word retracted in red across it, so that anybody reading it knows that this article has been retracted. Earlier articles, if you downloaded the PDF, that's not going to say retracted. But the best practice is to actually change the name of the article to start with retracted article : then the article name. This is just to make it completely obvious to readers, especially if authors have already included an article in their like reference database, and they're going to use it for their work in the future. If they go back and see that the article has now been retracted, they would reconsider using that article. This is an example of a correction. In this case, the article is published with an error. The correction notice explains the article, gives the bibliometrics, and explains what happens, or what happened, and that the authors apologize for these errors. It's not technically necessary to apologize if it's an accident, but it's a nice thing to say. And here's an example of an expression of concern from our journal, Artificial Cells, Nanomedicine and Biotechnology, which was hit quite significantly with paper mill articles. And in this case, we wanted readers to know that we're still investigating the article, but we have not heard from the author or their institution. And we want readers to know that we are concerned. It was most likely for an image manipulation reason, such as image duplication. This might be up if we're still waiting to hear back from the authors or their institution. But ideally, an expression of concern isn't posted indefinitely. Rather, it's a retraction is appended to it. And here's an example of a retraction. The good thing about this retraction notice is that it's a positive one. It's retracted by we, the editor, authors, and publisher. So in this case, the authors actually brought the error to the attention of the publisher. They found that they had a coding error that affected the results of the paper, including the conclusions. So that's not something that we could correct with a correction notice, because the changes would be too vast. It would be an entirely new article. And then finally, a removal. Removals are the least common post-publication notice. So what is the guidance on these? The reason removals, full removals, this is where, unlike retractions, where the PDF of the article is stamped with red retraction, the article is actually removed from online. So only people that have already downloaded the PDF have access to it. And this is to prevent people from having access to an article. The reason we don't do it often is because publishers, we have a responsibility towards the permanency of the content once it's published. So we don't want to silently disappear problematic articles. A removal rather than a retraction is only considered in specific circumstances, such as defamation or legal concerns. If the content is subject to a court order, if there's high risk of harm, if the content of the article is acted upon, for example, if there's bad medical advice, or if there's a breach of privacy, such as an image of a participant who did not give consent for their image to be there. The record of the article doesn't disappear. We'll show you a removal notice on the next slide. Rather, there's a notice that takes the place of the PDF with the reason for the removal. This is withdrawal. They're somewhat interchangeable. We are trying to keep the language increasingly consistent to go from withdrawal to removal. This just says that it's been removed for legal reasons. You don't need to go into detail. That would often negate the reason for removal. It's typically a private reason. So ultimately, who is responsible for publication ethics? The answer is all of us: authors, institutions, editors, reviewers, and publishers. Collectively, we need to work together to ensure that the content published is accurate and reliable, and that any ethical issues that arise before publication are investigated thoroughly and corrective measures are taken as appropriate. So I'm going to leave you with 5 practical take-home tips on avoiding problems. First is on authorship. Key here is agree on authorship early on based on the criteria and responsibilities. So if you're submitting to Taylor&Francis, check out our 5 authorship criteria. Any publisher should list their authorship criteria on their editorial policies. You can also check out COPE that provides guidance on authorship. Ensure that anyone who meets authorship criteria has been included. Don't forget anybody. If they find out that somebody's been left off after the article has been published, that can cause a lot of heartache. Be aware of the role and responsibilities of the corresponding author. While all authors assume responsibility for the content, the corresponding author ensures that all authors agree on which journal to submit it to, that they agree on any changes made, and that all declarations and competing interests on funding have been stated in the article. So it's a lot of boxes to check. Tip 2, securely store your original data. And this includes images, and make sure they're clearly labeled and stored securely. Be ready to share your files upon request with the journal editorial office. There's a lot of people that are looking at articles now that articles are becoming increasingly open access and scrutinizing them. And if we do receive a request of concern about images or data, we do expect images and data to be readily available. The expectation of being readily available does decrease with time, but as it's increasingly easy to store your data in the cloud indefinitely, I suppose our sympathy for lost data shrinks. And finally, ensure anonymity of participants in any data sets which need to be shared. Make sure they're appropriately anonymized or de-identified. Tip 3, check mandatory requirements. This is just your basic journal homepage list of requirements. It includes the confirmation about originality. So that means that you are truly the originator of this data and that any credit has been given to other people. Clinical trial registration has been made and that you've included the registration number of the clinical trial in your article. Check mandatory data sharing policies and mandatory deposition policies. Sometimes journals have their own depository, and sometimes it's just a requirement that it's deposited publicly prior to publication. Include declarations on ethical conduct of the study. So this includes if you have ethical approval for your study or if it was waived, state this in the article clearly. We explain on Taylor&Francis editorial policies that if your ethics board waived the need for ethics review, such as for an interview study or a non-interventional or low-risk study, you should state in the article why this was waived. Also, ethics for animal research. If you have an IACUC committee at your institution, state that your article was approved by them and the approval number. Ensure that you've considered dual use research of concern. So this is something that dual uses are findings that can be used for good and bad. For example, nuclear research could be used for good. It could be used for illicit research. If informed consent was collected from subjects, state that. And finally, if they're not subjects in a research study, but they're identifiable, ensure that consent to publish was obtained. And finally, our last tip is to cite all relevant sources in previous versions. This includes preprints, and obtain permission for reuse for any copyrighted content. If you have access to a plagiarism checker, we do recommend you do that. Sometimes it's unintentional. If you're just really familiar with a particular area of literature, you might not even realize that you're reusing something that's by somebody else. Turn it in as the institutional version. Make sure that you cite appropriate, balanced, and relevant sources. It's appropriate to cite yourself, but keep it balanced. If there's any full previous versions of your article online, like preprints, cite those in your references and provide the DOI to that. And ensure permissions have been obtained for copyright or licenses for any images, models, including tables and figures. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. And I think if there have been any questions, I'm happy to take those. I'll turn it back over to Jackson.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. So with that, we've got a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to do my best to try to put them together. Some of the questions touch on very similar aspects, so I'll try to merge them and combine them when possible. One that multiple people have asked in different wording is, do you have suggestions or are there guidelines on the order of authors' names, in particular when there's an unequal percentage or unequal amount of collaboration? So for example, if author A did half the research and then authors B, C, and D did increasingly less, is there a proper guideline for the order to list? I'm going to quickly try to find the other question that was related to that in case there was a small technical difference in the wording, but if you want to begin your answer on that, that'd be great.
Sure, that's something that's completely up to the authors. It doesn't affect your citation. It doesn't affect your the scholarly record. It's completely subjective, up to the authors to decide. But it's something to decide prior to submission.
Okay.
If we receive a request to change the order of authors, we would then contact all authors to make sure everyone is okay with changing the order. It's a lot easier if you just decide prior to submission.
Okay. So no general rule. It's just a matter of sort of equal consent among everyone and
Yep.
agreement among the authors. An expanded question from the asker of that is, with regards to the corresponding author, can a PhD student be the corresponding author, or is it mandatory to add the supervisor's name as correspondent?
No, a PhD student can be a corresponding author. It's a good experience for PhD students to have. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Let's move on to some additional questions. What is the best way to proceed if you yourself are the ghost author, meaning you contributed significantly to a manuscript and you find out that it was published, but you've not even been acknowledged?
Well, you could contact the authors that have listed themselves, but you're welcome to get in touch with the journal. Probably if you got in touch with the journal editor, our first step would be to get in touch with the authors and ask them why they left you off. And if they refuse to add you and you think you have a good case for being an author, we would turn it over to the institution. Generally, we have kind of an email template. We get in touch with the best person to get in touch with our institutions are research integrity officers. And if there's not one, we would probably ask a dean to look into it.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind just repeating your example of the conflicting interests involving Indigenous communities?
Oh, sure. So I gave an example of it's a competing interest. It's not a bad thing. It's just your perspective might be influenced. My example is if you're writing an article about an Indigenous community, say an Australian Aboriginal group, and you yourself are an Aborigine, that would be something to disclose or to consider disclosing because it could influence it very, very likely influences your perspective on that community, and it's something that readers would want to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. We've had multiple questions around the topic of publications that are derived from a doctoral thesis or vice versa with regards to citing and things like that.
Yeah, we do get this question a lot. The best thing to do is upon submission, tell the editor that this is being derived from your doctoral thesis. If there's large chunks of text that are completely identical to your doctoral thesis, we might ask why you're trying to publish it again. That could be considered a duplicate publication. If you're keeping the majority of the text exactly the same, only with maybe 2 paragraphs of the whole article different, we probably would not want to publish that because it's so substantially similar to your earlier publication. But if you think you've made, I don't know, a spin-off article, you've done a follow-up study of your PhD dissertation, then yeah, just reference it, tell the editor, and it would be considered.
Thank you. I think you addressed, I'm going to read another question that I think you addressed, but maybe just in terms of if there's additional terminology or certain forms that can be used. Someone asked, what's the best way to reach out to a journal or editor regarding unfair authorship listing, and what is the typical, what is typically the way to find a solution for it? So I think this goes to the example of the order, and it's mostly a matter of having consensus, or just reach, for example, for the ghost authorship question, reaching out in the first place, the author, and just asking what happened. Are there certain forms that are associated with this, certain terminology that's specific, like certain sort of, I don't know, arbitration or terminology that might trigger appropriate reactions by the educational institution? Or is this just verbatim the same answer to the other?
Well, I guess on a practical level, who do you get in touch with? You can get in touch with anybody you can find a contact information for. Editors should have, the editors-in-chief should have their emails listed on the journal homepage. You are welcome to contact them. If the managing editor's email address is listed there, welcome to contact them. Contact the help desk. Eventually, your complaint will find its way to the right person. We do follow kind of standardized guidance issued by the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. They have really like clean and simple flowcharts, such as request for authorship change prior to publication or request for authorship change post-publication. You start out at a box. What's been requested? Do all authors agree? Yes, no. If no, then we ask for an explanation, and if there's no resolve, then we'll go to the institution. But if the authors can come to a resolve among themselves, then there's no need to involve the institution.
Okay, I think you touched on how generally a journal will ask if you're submitting an article to any other journals. Someone asks, what happens if 2 similar articles are sent to different magazines at the same time and they are both published? I presume that's not too common based on your earlier remarks, but in the event that it does happen.
It depends on how similar they are. If they're, we've seen some that are exactly the same, except like small words have been changed just so that it doesn't get picked up as easily in plagiarism checkers. No, that's not okay. If it's the same takeaway from either article, same conclusions. Conclusions are key. If the conclusion in both articles are the same, that's a red flag.
Okay. In the case of the title, somebody asks, if I've presented a short abstract at a conference, can I use the same title when I'm submitting the full paper to a journal?
Yeah, that's fine. Abstract was one of the things that I mentioned was okay to reuse. Just be sure you cite the original abstract in your references.
Okay. I think we're getting through a lot of questions. There's still some more coming in. I encourage people to continue submitting. Let me just try to make sure I can digest and read all of these. If you were writing everything on your own, but some part is still coming under plagiarism, I presume maybe being triggered as plagiarism by the software, and changing statement may lead to a change in the context. So if the software says that you are plagiarizing when you're not, and you really cannot or will not or do not want to reword in order to preserve optimal wording, what are your options to move forward?
So if we are looking at an article investigating it for plagiarism, if we see one sentence that's pretty similar, it's not going to be a big deal. If it's one sentence that's verbatim from somebody else's article, that would be a concern. But if it's from your own article and you just have a really good way of explaining one particular method, that wouldn't be a huge cause for concern. But if you know exactly where that sentence initially appears, just cite it. If you cite it, put it in quotations, no problem.
Are there parameters to establish plagiarism and recycling? Is this a matter of percentages? Are there hard and fast rules for this?
There are no hard and fast rules. It would be easier if there were hard and fast rules, but because it's completely expected to quote other people and reuse text, that's how scholarly publishing builds upon itself, is by referencing your forefathers. That's expected. But what we do look for is to make sure it's referenced, and that if it's the verbatim text, that it's included in quotations.
Okay.
Some journals might set exact cutoffs, like at 60%, but at least Taylor&Francis doesn't have a set cutoff of percentage.
When it comes to those tools for checking plagiarism, you said to check with your institution first. Other than one's own institution, are some of these open source and free? Can you pay if you're not affiliated? Just in terms of overall recommendations for using the tools available to you to check for plagiarism.
Yeah, that's not something that I spent a lot of time looking into, but I would, and you can get your own license. I know when Taylor&Francis runs cross-ref checks, I think it's like 2 cents a paper, but that's because we have a subscription. So it would probably be a bit more expensive than that if you bought it on your own. But
generally, the journal itself will provide these tools.
Yeah, you won't get the results. You'll only know if there's a problem.
Hopefully they don't know. Hopefully there's no problem. Let's see. I've got a lot of great questions coming in. I'm going to try to select remaining questions that have broad relevance to as many people as possible. Is there an acceptable time to wait between submission and answer before sending a request for a reminder, so that you're not insisting too much, but you're also just not waiting idly? Is it maybe 1 or 2 months?
Yeah, 1 or 2 months you could expect. That's kind of typical for how long. But there's no cutoff date. If you're waiting 6 months and you haven't heard anything, I would recommend following up, just to make sure. Who knows what could have happened? I mean, when COVID first hit, the timeline for peer review slowed down quite a bit because people had their families at home. So journals put notices that the duration of peer review might be a little bit longer than expected. But if you're concerned, yeah, reach out. Editors are people too.
I'll just quickly repeat a few questions that I think you've addressed, just to make sure there's not a subtle nuance or difference in the question. So you said it's fine to present a paper to conference and then to a journal. Tools for checking, as long as it's cited. Checking for plagiarism, the journal will provide an response to you if there's an issue. Other than that, please use your own university or institution to use their tools to check. I think this is similar wording, but you said someone asks, may we include the published papers in a PhD thesis if the results are derived from the PhD study?
Yeah, again, cite it and tell the editor up front that this is being derived from a PhD thesis.
Okay. Here's an example that touches on one of your earlier slides. If someone contacts an author and the author asks him for accepting the manuscript in exchange for a sum of money, and he or she will get published. For example, this case can be a case in publishing ethics. How can a researcher overcome this problem? Sort of, you could argue it's a sort of, I mean, there's certain ethical dilemma there. If this happens, do you simply move on and ignore the author, or?
So if you're the author and somebody gives you a proposition, if you pay me $1,000, I'll help you get an authorship. Say no, definitely say no. If it's found out that you purchased your paper will be retracted, and you'll be in a worse situation than you were before. If you hear about something like this and you're just concerned that this is happening, you can definitely tell the editor. who will then ask the author if this is true. And he would probably, if we catch wind of this and we think that somebody has purchased an authorship, we might ask them to provide their original data. If they conducted the study themselves, we would expect them to have the data in hand. It's a bit like calling somebody's bluff, but it's a pretty good way to check. And we do this for images too. If there's image concerns, such that we've seen this image in another paper before, we would want to see the original one. And generally, the person that has the original image is the one that actually did the study. People are getting really good at faking, though. It's becoming increasingly challenging.
I wanted to ask you this question specifically because I didn't read your bio at the beginning of the webinar, but it was available on the registration page and the event description. But just to highlight this while we're speaking live, one of your areas of focus within Taylor&Francis is whistleblowing, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously a very relevant question for you. Besides someone's using one of the alternative terms you mentioned, besides declaring conflict of interest, is there anything you advise the author to do when they are publishing an article that is related to a patent request?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure I understand the question. It's similar. If you're publishing something about a patent, make sure the patent is legally allowed to be published. We have had to remove papers that publish details about a patented invention that was not permitted to be made public. And because the description included in the article was patented, we had to completely remove the patent, or we had to completely remove the article, and in that case, replace it with a removal notice.
Okay. I have a lot of these questions. I think I'm understanding the general intent and the heart of the question. If I've somehow misrepresented a question, please feel free to email me afterwards. You'll find the contact information for both EURAXESS hubs afterwards, and we want to help you in your career growth and career training. Someone asks, if a researcher publishes a paper on the theoretical part of the topic, and then he or she publishes again on the practical part of that topic, can those be considered two different papers?
Yeah. I mean, if it's theoretical versus practical, those sound like two different aspects. But again, we'd be looking at the conclusion. If you're using the complete same introduction, like it's like 3 pages of identical, and then you just apply it to practical versus theoretical, you might be flagged for that. So definitely reference the articles within each other.
Thank you. Among your earlier slides, you may have addressed this. If someone has forgotten to put some references in his or her paper, what is that type of error, and what is the follow-up response to correct that?
I guess it depends. How likely is it that you forgot? If you forgot to quote 2 pages of text, the paper would probably be retracted. We probably wouldn't believe that you've just happened to forget to quote somebody. If it's a small section, that happens all the time. That could be corrected with a correction notice. The correction notice would say, author X realized after publication that he forgot a citation. Citation to Dr. B has been added.
Thank you. I hope this isn't a common problem. Someone asked, what law applies? It's a jurisdictional question when there's an ethics problem if the author's country and the editor's country differ.
Ooh, that's a good question. They're not really ethical laws. I guess each country does have different laws, but we tend to follow the Helsinki Declaration. So that's just a general kind of an ethical declaration that states consent must be obtained. Participants must be aware of the experiments that they're going to take part in. We go kind of high level to make sure there's just the basic elements of consent and ethics included in the article. Taylor&Francis is based out of the UK and the US, so a lot of the rules and regulations that we look at are from the UK and the US. But we generally try and look at kind of at a higher level.
So some people are submitting additional questions in response to the questions. So I think this is really interesting how we have some deep layers here. A few people are asking for the presentation. Thank you very much, Genevieve, for agreeing to share that afterwards. So I'll make a PDF version available, most likely sometime tomorrow. You'll get an automated email tomorrow or Saturday from the GoToWebinar platform, in which case, during which you'll find a link on both the Latin America and the Caribbean and the North America web posts with a video recording and the presentation from Genevieve. So thank you very much. A lot of people will be able to dive into those slides a bit further. With regards to your presentation on intellectual property, I think someone's expressing an interest in perhaps discussing further. So please, I'll ask that person to contact me and or you directly, since I know you have your email address here on the screen share right now. Someone asks, does any editorial board use artificial intelligence methods to verify the accuracy of the bibliography? So I guess a similar aspect to using the plagiarism check. Is there something similar for bibliographies? This is probably a long-term question where the answer will change in the coming months and years.
Yeah, that's not something that we as publishers look at, but that is something that indexing services like Claravit look at. So when Claravit decides which journals are going to be indexed and given an impact factor, they look at journal citation practices. They look kind of for bad things. So if they see that the journal is excessively citing other articles within the journal, they might be denied an impact factor because of suspicious behavior. But I think that there are certainly tools out there that you could use if you're just curious.
I think I'll try to ask a few more questions. I think we've addressed a lot of them. Other ones we'll be happy after the fact to continue the dialogue by email. Someone asks, how seriously do journals take pub peer reviews when one's peers raise points about questionable data?
Pub peer, we do listen to pub peer comments. Some publishers have subscriptions to pub peer, and journals can actually have individual subscriptions to pub peer and receive notifications when there's a comment on their article. But because Taylor&Francis owns 2,500 journals, there are a lot of comments. So we generally we do respond to them if we see them. We don't have the practice of nobody told us, we're not going to address it. If we see that somebody has commented on a pub peer article, we will treat it as an anonymous complainant or just as any other whistleblower. I think pub peer is a great service, by the way. A lot of useful information has come from it.
Someone comments just in terms of your earlier sort of introduction into the ethical issues in some of your first slides. Someone just comments, I'm not sure it's a question, but that the salami practice of publishing results in several journals per study in several languages is something of a standard practice. So I think you definitely hit a lot of the problems there.
Gotcha.
Okay, someone asks, if I am in a professional transition between two institutions, how can I deal with that? Do I sign as a researcher in ... XYZ field or institution?
Yep. So we expect you to list your affiliation as the institution you were affiliated with when you conducted the research. So if you're affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania when you did the research, but by the time the article is actually published, you've moved on to the University of Texas, you should list you could list both, but you would definitely list the University of Pennsylvania because that's where your salary and where your research funding was coming from. Oftentimes, if you want to list the new affiliation, we can put a footnote and say the author has since changed institutions. But we don't. Sometimes we do get occasional requests to fudge institutions, such as if you really want your new institution to get credit so that you can get promotion. No, we don't fudge. It needs to be where the research was actually conducted.
Maybe I'll ask 2 or 3 questions if time remains on your side as well.
Sure.
I'll encourage people if in the remaining couple minutes to submit those. Someone supposes, let's say there are multiple papers with similar conclusions. Do we need to cite every single one if we're citing basically that one conclusion? Will it create any problems if we miss citing a few of those?
Citing different, I guess I can see how you could get this misconstrued. If you're verbatim reaching the same conclusion in multiple papers such that it could get picked up on a plagiarism check, then yeah, we would expect you to cite where this conclusion originally came from. But if they're just if they're on similar topics, reaching similar results, we don't expect you to cite everything that's ever been published in the field. You're just, for example, a replication study. If you're replicating a study that's already been done, we would expect you to cite that the initial study that you're replicating, but we don't expect you to cite every other study that's at all related.
Next question we have, someone asks, what kind of documents should I have to prove that my research was carried out by a community or a group, for example? So if I'm reading into this correctly, your example of if someone goes with an indigenous community and carries out research, I mean, I'm sort of twisting the example here, but how do you demonstrate that? How do you prove that?
The research, I guess I'm not totally clear on the question.
I'll invite Wellington to maybe submit with a couple extra explanatory sentences if he's still connected and listening. Thank you everyone for the questions that continue to pour in. I hope we can get to is a couple extras and then we'll be available afterwards by email for more. Someone asked about predatory journals. How does a researcher detect these?
Yeah, so there's something called think, check, submit. It's just a basic like stop, drop, and roll before you submit to a journal. Basically, look at the journal's website. Do they have an address, or is it a PO box somewhere in the middle of a desert? Are there typos on their website? Are there editors and chiefs listed? Are there board members listed? Do the editors and the board members that are listed know that they're board members? A lot of times, I mean, there's things you can look at, like Beale's list, which has since been discontinued, but that's a list of journals that were thought to be predatory. There's Cabell's list of the black and white list. So those are resources you can check out. They're not like scientifically proven, but they're a good first step. Also, email the journal. If you receive any emails with unexpected charges or really high charges that you didn't expect to pay, reconsider.
So I think if it works for you, let's ask maybe 3 more questions. I have some great questions that I don't want to ignore here. Someone asks, have you seen any specific issues related to the social sciences? Just perhaps is an overarching field. There's certain common issues that in the social sciences get run into more than the hard sciences.
Probably plagiarism of ideas is more common within social sciences. The ideas are a little more fluid, which makes those kind of cases harder to prove, such as somebody might have had an idea for a study and they presented it at a conference. Somebody at the conference was listening to their presentation and writes a paper about it. They might be accused of plagiarizing or stealing an idea, but that's really hard to prove. There's no textual overlap. Those ones make my hands sweat a little bit.
Someone asks, if I have research knowledge acquired in private companies, can I apply them at the public university at the teaching level?
I guess it depends on the contract you signed with the private company. Do you have a non-disclosure agreement with them? If so, don't disclose it. Check with the company to make sure it's okay to do.
I think we'll close with this one. Someone asks, how can I efficiently differentiate common knowledge from plagiarism? And maybe this person's asking in a general sense, but then also just when it comes to the checking software to avoid common trips.
Yeah, I mean, don't get too hung up on just a couple sentences. If it's common knowledge, the plagiarism checks scan. What happens is we upload a PDF of your article to a plagiarism software, and it scans every other published article. It scans the internet. It like refreshes itself a couple of times, and just looks for anything that's remotely similar. And a lot of times it picks up like junk or just stuff that like we're not particularly concerned about. You should only really be concerned if you are literally copying and pasting from another article into yours. If you're writing something just sitting at your computer, the chances are you're not going to be plagiarizing somebody. it's harder than you would expect to actually like come up with the exact same sentence constructs.
Well, you've been really generous with your time, Genevieve. Thank you so much for staying for a bunch of questions. I'll repeat myself again that I encourage our members throughout all of the Western Hemisphere to get in touch if you're in the US or Canada. My colleague and I are really happy. Our email address is here at the top. We're happy to follow up with you. And then our colleagues in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, their email address is there. These are all clickable links that when you see the PDF presentation tomorrow or on Saturday when we make it available on the website, you'll be able to follow all of our social media channels, get in touch, and then subscribe to our newsletters as well. So on behalf of EURAXESS North America and LAC, we'd like to thank you for attending. Genevieve, the information today was really important and impactful in the Q&A session. I learned a lot myself as well. So thank you so much for partnering with us. As I said earlier, we want to hear from you. So please be in touch with your EURAXESS Hub. We will follow up with that email to attendees that comes from the webinar platform that will contain a recording of this presentation. It'll also have a link to the upcoming webinars in this series, including the next one on Thursday, May 27th. So I just want to leave you all with a quick overview of the one next month, and then in September and October, we'll also have those. Those are all going to be in the morning time, so 10 a.m. Eastern time. Here, obviously, in the Washington, D.C., New York City, Eastern time of the U.S. Time zone. But regardless of where you are, it's morning in the Americas. So please visit your EURAXESS North America and Latin America Caribbean homepage just to find the specific times for your region. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you again, Genevieve. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.